Okay, I guess we can start. So good morning. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this FSR online event. It's really a pleasure for me to introduce you to our new event where we will present the results of our newly released cost effectiveness decarbonization study. This study is a sort of, let's say, a follow-up, an update from a major study we did last year. But as you know, talking about very timely and very much quickly evolving topics, of course, we keep monitoring data and the evolution of the energy policies in this sector. So regarding hydrogen, regarding the evolving role of the gas in the future energy transition. And so we are really happy to present the results of this updated study today. I'm joined by James Kneebone, who will present the study, the results, the main researcher on this study. James is a research assistant in the gas team of the Florence School of Regulation. Welcome, James. And Christopher Jones, you know him, a part-time professor also at the Florence School of Regulation. And we will have also the chance to discuss. We have Ronnie Belmans, professor at KU Leuven. And of course, we will be happy to listen also to your comments, to take questions from the audience. This study was very importantly was carried on with the financial support of the Naturgy Foundation. So we are very thankful for this opportunity, and I know that we will have someone from Naturgy joining us in the course of today. This said, I look forward to hearing what James is going to present with a specific focus on renewable energy metrics, hydrogen costs, and the various market factors impacting on how to make decarbonization cost effective. Please, James.
Many thanks, Ilaria, for the introduction. Much appreciated, and to everyone who's joining us this morning. I think, yes, and it has the slides. Perfect. So yes, as Ilaria says, this morning I'll be presenting fundamentally the data points. If you go to the next slide, Nina. Thanks. So we'll start with the scope. So what this study tries to achieve versus the original from 2020. And then in terms of the cost metrics, we can consider them roughly divided between electricity in terms of cost, LCOE, as well as capacity, and then we'll move into hydrogen, cost per origin, as well as the impacts of carbon pricing. So that's how you might go about switching from fossil to renewable or low carbon. And then Christopher is going to take us through some of the policy implications that we've derived based on our findings. So next slide, please. Let's get into it. So the original study was very comprehensive, more than 200 pages, really very detailed, and going into was essentially a literature review of some of the predominant pieces of research covering these areas of interest. So bringing together that data, finding averages, and trying to give a sort of rough indication of where sort of our most credible guesses from various well-informed and well-researched institutions were indicating that the sector might be going in. Next slide. The 2022 version gives a sort of more succinct, way slimmed down update. So we're looking in particular just at a few key cost indicators, and then we've left the sort of policy side or the implications, so to speak, broadly for a follow-up opinion article, which, as I say, Christopher will sort of be fleshing out the details on. We're also reflecting on some of the issues like the impact of COVID, of energy price crisis over the past 6 months or so, as well as the latest in big environmental reports. So the IPCC AR6, for example. We've also added a little bit more in terms of technical details, which we'll see. Next slide, please. So yeah, the numbers, and we can start with electricity. Next slide, please. So yes, we have here utility scale solar, rooftop scale solar, onshore wind and offshore wind, same as in the previous study. And what we're looking at here is domestic. So it's what can be produced in the EU, and our cost indicators for that In gray, you have the numbers from the 2020 version, and in black, you have our new numbers. Something to keep in mind off the bat is we tried to give a more robust methodology for this updated version. So we're also taking into account the cost of capital here, the cost of financing associated with this. So that has led to a slight overall inflation of the numbers versus the old ones. That being said, you can still see that there's a really significant range of uncertainty in the numbers, particularly at the moment, lesser in 2030 and lesser again by 2050. So we see overall sort of the range decreasing. Versus the previous numbers, we see that probably there's a higher bottom end, i.e. the cheapest that we can envisage is slightly more expensive than previously estimated. And in some cases, the top end has come down, particularly when we look to the sort of midterm, timescales or in the long term as well. As I say, it's also conflated a little bit by the fact that we have a more robust methodology here. But you can see that the most aggressive cost decrease is envisaged for offshore wind, where we see significant sort of scale up potential. This also reflects a little bit the quality of renewable conditions that are available, so to speak. So availability of solar and wind conditions. Can move on. This is a new aspect that we've added for this study, which looks at the capacity. We envisage the technical capacity for production as well as just the cost. So this is about the sort of anticipated renewable electricity relative to overall demand. So it's taking into account energy efficiency gains, so overall reduced demand and that sort of drive to efficiency, as well as coupled with a drive to electrify sectors, which is pushing up overall demand as well. And considering those two aspects, we see that it's very unlikely there will be surplus renewable electrons beyond, before sort of 2040 or 2045. And that gives us an indication of scarcity, and therefore how targeted we are in the allocation of those electrons is very, very important, because we see an opportunity cost for their allocation, i.e. you use them in one application, you'll not be able to use them elsewhere. Where do they derive the most value in terms of decarbonisation, and at what most optimal cost? And in that way, we should be considering not only pure LCOE in terms of cost effectiveness, but also, as I say, that opportunity cost aspect. Yes, I think could move on to the next slide as well, please. So, as I said, we can essentially at this point suggest that it's virtually impossible to consider a world where we're overbuilding renewable electricity generation, at least until 2050. And in an environment where we have surplus electrons, we can look at converting them into other energy vectors where they add value for decarbonisation, where direct electrification is not an attractive option. So here we're looking at one of the most widely discussed, and I think one of the most interesting parts of the report, which is the renewable hydrogen versus low carbon and fossil hydrogen. So what we can see on the left is the 2020 numbers, on the right is the 2022 numbers, and the little shape outlines give an indication of the kind of hydrogen. So we're covering green hydrogen of two different origins. So for utility scale solar as well as offshore wind, and then we're covering domestically produced blue hydrogen as well as some blue hydrogen with biomethane. So we're looking at two different feedstocks there. For anyone who may not be familiar, turquoise hydrogen is also produced with a methane feedstock. So it's the same feedstock as you can use for blue hydrogen, steam methane reforming, but you're getting only solid carbon as an output, and it's an electrified production method. So you're not burning gas to create the heat, but rather using electricity, and in that way it can be an electrified and renewable, even zero carbon or carbon negative production method. For direct comparisons, as I said, you can look at those shapes to give an indication of the difference. Overall, we see that minimum costs for green hydrogen are similar or perhaps slightly higher overall than in the previous study. That again reflects a slightly more robust methodology in terms of the cost of renewable electricity. Blue hydrogen remains roughly the same as in the old study, but this, as I say, it's assuming a stable gas price. So what we tried to do with this study is not to try and predict exactly where a sort of normal electricity or gas price might fall in the context of the current energy crisis, but rather look at sort of numbers sort of pre-crisis and what some of the larger institutions were suggesting might happen when we've restabilized. You know, this is to be decided, or we'll see how it plays out. But the IEA, for example, envisaged that this, you know, the crisis of prices won't last indefinitely. So that's something important to keep in mind. And at the moment, for example, over the past 6 months, there have been plenty of cases in Europe where green hydrogen is cheaper than fossil hydrogen or blue hydrogen on the basis of how that energy is purchased. So whether it's a long-term PPA for renewable electricity at a lower price than spot prices for gas, for example. So you see overall through the numbers that green hydrogen is not competitive with blue hydrogen until 2030 or 2050, and unless we're looking in the most favorable cases. So for example, the very minimum price you might expect for solar PV or offshore wind, so sort of 1.3 or 1.8 euros per kilogram versus anywhere between 1 and 2 for blue hydrogen. So you can expect a sort of stable price there. But as I say, this is notwithstanding the current prices. Turquoise hydrogen is a really, really interesting one because one of the key variables for this is the value of the byproduct, which is the solid carbon. So you could imagine even the hydrogen being the byproduct in the event that pyrolysis is able to produce a high enough quality carbon that becomes the main product. This can be anything from carbon nanotubes at, you know, several thousand euros a kilogram, anything down to a sort of very low quality carbon product, which might be useful for circular economies, carbon farming, such like this, but at a lower value. So it's really a sort of unknown, and it'll be interesting to see how that technology evolves. It's also the least mature and the least widely applied currently, although there are examples of production of pyrolysis hydrogen now, which there weren't in 2020. So that's an evolution that we've seen since the previous study. But as I say, it's very much dependent on the value of that carbon product. Secondly, I would say the feedstock is important. So we see if you're to use biomethane as a feedstock in 2030, for example, which we can get some good data on, it's roughly triple or almost quadruple the price for a domestic blue hydrogen product versus natural gas. But keeping in mind that if you're then able to sequester the carbon from that, you're looking at a product that may also even be carbon negative. So Christopher will speak on the issue of cross-sectoral benefits. So the idea of contributing to circular economies or carbon farming objectives and such like this, and whether or not there should be a value derived from this, and whether or not our current taxonomies and our current methodologies for categorizing these gases is sufficient and is adequate at the moment. I would say just one more thing quickly that is interesting on these numbers is that, as I mentioned, both pyrolysis and electrolysis are electrified hydrogen production methods. So that's the green hydrogen and the turquoise hydrogen. But the key difference being, and this is broadly down to the nature of the feedstock, so pyrolysis using methane gas, whereas electrolysis using water, is that the strength of the bonds literally holding together the molecules is, you know, overwhelmingly stronger in water than it is in methane gas, and therefore pyrolysis takes anything up to maybe 15 or 20% of the energy required to produce the same amount of hydrogen as does electrolysis. So in that sense, we've seen in our data that it's much less sensitive to electricity prices than is electrolysis, because it requires, maybe a fifth of the electricity, for example. That being said, it's also dependent on the gas price because gas is still a feedstock. So these are the sort of relationships that we've been exploring. I think we could go to the next slide. So this was something interesting we looked at, which was the ETS switching prices. So essentially, the price of carbon required in order to motivate a shift from fossil, in this case, fossil hydrogen, so gray hydrogen, which is steam methane reformed hydrogen, which is the predominant method in Europe at the moment, to decarbonized methods. So either SMR with CCS, in the case of blue hydrogen, or renewable hydrogen, turquoise hydrogen, because the ETS is one of the sort of key market drivers that we have to move the sector at the moment. So that will give Chris some scope to go over what we've looked at as other methods that might be required, because as you can see from the numbers, broadly speaking, the ETS price can be seen as a relatively insignificant factor in driving switching in this area. We've seen, perhaps with the exception of blue hydrogen, i.e. the price required now, the carbon price is far too high to be effective. You can see anything up to 320 euros per ton, 300 euros per ton, 220 euros per ton. In the event you could have a very low emissions product, it could be within a reasonable range, so less than 100, which we've seen carbon prices in excess of 90 euros already this year. So this is within the feasible range, and you could imagine by 2030 it definitely could be a viable option for driving switching, particularly to blue hydrogen. But for renewable hydrogen, it's still it's possible, but it's difficult mathematically to imagine that switch. Other factors which we've seen to be more important are issues like electrolyzer cost, electrolyzer efficiency, and most importantly and overwhelming is the value of the commodity. So that's the natural gas price and the electricity price. As well as in the case of pyrolysis, again, the value of the co-product. You could very easily imagine a world where the ETS price is not important for making pyrolysis cost effective in the EU, in the event that they can get a strong return on the co-product value, so the solid carbon byproducts. And yes, again, with the ETS switching price for blue, it's also dependent on the supply chain emissions. So how you're calculating the overall emissions for production. It's also interesting to look at the biomethane figures. So we've also given figures for if you might use biomethane, sustainable biomethane, in terms of the blue hydrogen production. And you can see that those give really, really strong ETS numbers required. So anything up to 300 or 350 euros per ton. So relative to the previous numbers, they're quite similar to the 2020 study. And yeah, we're still seeing that even with, as I say, a slightly more robust methodology in this analysis. So the next slide, I think we're ready for, which looks at switching from natural gas to hydrogen. So this is about whether you might replace natural gas applications with renewable or low carbon hydrogen. And again, you can see even more strongly than in the previous slide, the higher prices required for renewable electricity than in the previous study are giving really very, very strong switching costs. So you can see that anything up to 725 euros per ton for a carbon price would be required at the moment, dropping to 200, 300 by 2050, but still, what you could imagine to be cost prohibitive. By 2050, the figures move overwhelmingly into a reasonable range. But it really, I would say, this data overwhelmingly illustrates the sort of the poor economic choice, you might say, of using hydrogen in place of natural gas, particularly for electricity generation. And I would also note that this argument becomes even more clear when you consider the difference in volumetric energy density between the two. So our figures assume an equivalent energy content per megawatt hour, but in reality, this is not the case. You get a considerably lower heating value from an equivalent volume of hydrogen. So there are areas where a direct switch might make sense in very specific applications, but we can see that overall, if that's the kind of switching we want to be encouraging, the ETS is unlikely to be a strong enough incentive or disincentive, depending on how you look at it, in order to make that switch. Unless, again, you see with the pyrolysis, it's very much dependent on the value of the co-product, on the value of the carbon. So it could be very high, 280 euros, for example, or it could be a completely unimportant factor. Again, depending on that co-product, basically. So there's lots of nuance to this subject. There's lots of sort of finer details that we can pick through, but these are sort of the major overall trends that I wanted to get across. So I think that's the last of my slides, and thanks for listening. Thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have. But first, I'll pass the floor back to Ilaria.
Great. Thank you very much, James. Very clear slides, lots of data, and I assume many questions generating from data. So actually, I see there is already even one question in the question and answers box. I invite everybody to type any questions for our speakers in the chat, and we will take them hopefully in the second part of this event. But now I would like to give the floor to Christopher Jones, please.
Thank you, Ilaria, and thank you, James, for a great presentation. Perhaps it's worth mentioning how we set out with this study right from the beginning, which we did also with the last one, which is that first we, Ilaria, Andres, myself, we asked our researchers to come up with these numbers without asking what are the conclusions you can draw from them. So the main purpose of this study is to try and get the most objective snapshot possible, looking at all the different data sources, reliable data sources we could find there. So the International Energy Agency, the Commission, et cetera, to try and really establish the most objective picture we could find on this, and to provide state-of-the-art numbers. And I'd like to thank James in particular for the work that he's done on that. So what are the conclusions that we would draw from this, that we've kicked around after the numbers have been done? And I'd just like to mention a few of them. And the first one is the green, blue, turquoise, yellow, gray, whatever color you like of the rainbow hydrogen you wish to believe in at the moment. And the answer to that is, and I think this study brings it out, it's impossible to know what is going to be the most competitive source in 2030, 2040, 2050. It's impossible to know. And any policy that is driven on the basis that you know what it's going to be is going to be wrong. That's the only thing you can absolutely guarantee, particularly because hydrogen is an OPEX-driven cost issue rather than a CapEx like renewable energy. But there are some important drivers, some knowables, that should drive policy decisions. So let's look at it might be green, it might be blue, it might be turquoise, and try and unpick them one by one. It might be green. Yeah, it might be green. And green is one of the technologies which, subject to life cycle emissions, which should be relatively limited, is zero carbon. And if renewable electricity is cheap enough, 10 euros a megawatt hour, you can produce, or sorry, less than that, you can produce hydrogen at $1.50. And that is possible. And there's a really good recent IRENA study on this that points out where you might actually produce hydrogen at $1.50 from renewable electricity. And there's one little problem there, which is the capacity to produce it at that price in Europe is 88 EJ, compared to North Africa, Middle East, 2023, the US 1,314, and Australia 1,272. In other words, the technical potential to produce what will be competitive, because if there's that much capacity in the world, once the world starts competing for it, there will be an enormous amount of technical capacity to produce renewable hydrogen, way cheaper than the EU. However, there's always a however here. It costs about from Colombia, a comment from Colombia. I'm still waiting for the numbers. It costs between $1. It's going to cost between $1 and $2 to ship hydrogen by boat, basically, which is therefore going to limit the EU's options. So, will it be green? Will hydrogen be green in Europe? So, if renewables is cheap enough in the EU and sufficiently available, it won't be. Not until 2035, 2040, as James has eloquently explained. because the supply of renewable electricity will be constrained. Obviously, you should use it for direct electrification before you use it for hydrogen if there are other very low carbon alternatives available. It needs to be used for direct electrification. And it won't be cheap enough either, because if it's not in great abundance, the price you're going to have to pay for renewable electricity is going to be the prevailing electricity price. Nobody is going to give you free, cheap PV if they can sell it for something much more expensive somewhere else. So green has very strong potential, but in order to make it the driving force in the EU, you're going to have to bring it probably from Northern Africa, which has its own challenges in that respect. Technically, not a problem in terms of producing it. Politically, economically, there are challenges, not least physically bringing it to the EU. Okay, so it might be blue. It might be blue. If the gas price goes down, as the International Energy Agency says it will, then according to the numbers generated by this study, then blue hydrogen will be significantly cheaper than green hydrogen in the EU for the next 15, 20 plus years. So if the gas price goes down, if we have cost-effective carbon capture and storage grid in time and storage, blue is likely to be far cheaper than green on the basis of this study, and significantly so. This gives a point as to the importance of CCS, but I'll come back onto that in a minute. It might be turquoise. So turquoise hydrogen, as William James said, uses natural gas as the feedstock, uses electricity, renewable electricity, let's say, same as electrolysis, as the power source, produces carbon black. So subject to mixing a limited amount of biomethane into the mix to compensate for any, or not any, for whatever the level of methane emissions, fugitive methane emissions, if you like, in the natural gas using as feedstock. It's zero carbon. If you use a lot of more methane, biomethane, it can be negative. So there, the issue is one of, as James said, technical development, technological maturity. It's interesting the speed how this technology is moving. The US government has just given a $1 billion risk loan to Monolith Materials in the US to produce it at the next stage of large-scale demonstration. And $1 billion gets you quite a long way in terms of the plan. So there are real developments there. It might be yellow, depending on how you wish to calculate the cost of nuclear electricity. So what do you draw from those observations based on this study? The first is, this is really important, the difference between, in 2030, on average figures, producing hydrogen from offshore wind in the EU and blue hydrogen in the EU is 2.8 euros a kilo. The EU, in its hydrogen strategy, quite correctly, has the target of producing 10 million tons to get rid of all the grey hydrogen, and 2 million tons for transport, industry, whatever. That's 10 million tons. Makes a lot of sense. 10 million tons is 10 billion kilos. So if you're producing that 10 billion kilos using offshore wind renewables, which is largely the plan, that means you're going to have to, compared to blue, that means you're going to have to spend 28 billion euros a year in subsidies to save the GHG differential between green and blue. Now, if you build a new SMR with CCS, you can get it to 95% capture rates. So you'd therefore be spending 28 billion in order to save 5% of the CO2. I personally think it'd be better to refurbish houses for that money. So there's an important issue there. The other is that other new technologies are developing as we speak. And so the only conclusions that you can draw from this is that the import of green hydrogen is going to be a really important option for the EU. Blue is going to be extremely important if we want to have a competitive hydrogen market in the future. And that therefore CCS is going to be extremely important. But at the end of the day, the real conclusion you draw there is that this is unpredictable. If the gas prices remain high, as they are today, the whole logic flips on its head. And so the only conclusion you can draw is any market for hydrogen that is designed by a policymaker will be wrong. We need an internal market for hydrogen. We have an internal market for electricity, which has served us well, an internal market for gas, which has served us well. We need an internal market for hydrogen. There's no reason why it should be different than electricity. But there, of course, the drivers are twofold. They are GHG and they are cost. And so the key issue at the end of the day is, number one, the regulatory framework should be designed on a technological neutral basis. And the new Commission proposal in this respect is on gas and hydrogen. It's very good because it provides the possibility for certification on an objective basis for blue hydrogen. There's a couple of things that require attention. One is there is no definition for zero carbon hydrogen, which doesn't make sense because you can produce zero carbon hydrogen from pyrolysis. You can produce it from blue hydrogen by mixing adequate amount of biomethane into the methane mix. So there should be a definition for zero carbon hydrogen. There should be a definition for negative carbon hydrogen. We need this in order to do carbon removals, and also specific targets for green hydrogen and specific support schemes for green hydrogen. When you're talking about actually producing the amount of hydrogen you need for the economy, don't really make sense. It makes a lot of sense to do research for hydrogen, for electrolysis, but actually to have technology specific support schemes for quantities of green hydrogen rather than blue hydrogen should be technology neutral, in my opinion. This is actually rather important because we are not learning the lessons of what we did in renewables. In renewables, we won the race to give subsidies and lost the race to produce the product. So we import all our PV panels from China, and we're doing the same thing again. Now, electrolyzers, hydrogen, is CapEx, not OpEx. And the policy of kickstarting demand for renewable electricity by doing feed-in tariffs, contracts difference made sense because the economies of scale from manufacturing were the key thing to driving down costs. That is not going to be the case with hydrogen. What it's going to be is, yes, reducing the CapEx through R&D and I, but you're not going to reduce the CapEx by supporting huge quantities of green hydrogen production. So yes, absolutely. Put huge amounts of money into R&D and I. Make sure that we're producing these electrolyzers at home, not importing them. And this is starting in front of our eyes. I was talking to somebody a couple of days ago, and imports of electrolyzers from China are now beginning. Let's please make sure we don't make this mistake again. And win the race to provide subsidies and lose the race to be the technology leader. That makes no sense whatsoever. The second point I'd raise is in relation to carbon capture and storage. So if you look at the conclusions on this study, and I'll just talk about two of them. One is that without carbon capture and storage for hydrogen, we will have no blue hydrogen. That's clear. The other one is for energy intensive industry. Now, energy intensive industry produces about 20% of our CO2. The figures, and okay, if you're steel, if you're cement, how are you going to decarbonize? because most of your energy is used to produce high heat. How are you going to decarbonize? At the moment, at least, technologically wise, and there's nothing on the horizon over the next few years, you can't use electricity. You can't electrify a steel furnace, a cement kiln. You have to use molecules due to energy density. So, under the Commission's proposal for the ETS revision and the CBAM, we are intending to bring these into the ETS, which makes sense, as I say. They account for a great deal of our CO2. If we don't manage to put them on a decarbonisation path now, there is no way on God's green earth that we are going to reach any sensible CO2 target in 2040. It's just not going to happen. So if you can't electrify, the only game in town is carbon capture and storage. Take the post-combustion CO2 and store it. Now, that gets to anywhere up to, with new technology, 90 to 95% carbon capture and then storage. And the problem is this: if you look at the figures that James put out, if you want to try and replace natural gas by hydrogen, it's not going to work. CCS, on the other hand, if you look at the IEA figures, is a relatively cost-effective way. Producing steel with CCS should increase price of steel by about 8 to 10%. So unless you have CCS, the only effect of bringing it into the ETS and the CBAM is if you don't have it, they can't decarbonize because they can't use hydrogen. Never going to happen. You need $500 a ton. So you can either give massive subsidies or simply bring them into the ETS and don't give them a decarbonisation option, which means what are you doing? You're taxing steel and not having any GHG benefits. Doesn't make sense at all. So without CO2, CCS, you're not going to be able to decarbonise energy-intensive industry, and you won't have blue hydrogen, and you are not laying the ground for the sustainable carbon cycles. Sustainable carbon cycles, taking biogenic CO2 from agriculture in particular, and sequestrating it in order to have negative emissions. At the moment, CCS is like the poor orphan of European energy policy. It's neglected and left in the corner. And unless the Commission and the EU takes this and drives it, we will not achieve our objectives. That's clear, Green Deal objectives. So this is really important. I mean, it would, in a typical European schizophrenic approach to energy policy, we are now beginning to invest in storage for hydrogen on land, but we are prohibiting CO2. I don't know about you. If I was given the choice to live over a CO2 storage or hydrogen storage, well, I'm happy with both, but you know what I mean. So I would like to leave my comments there because we're already 40 minutes in, and now pass the floor back to Ilaria.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Christopher. Always very, very interesting insights, very thoughtful. I would like now, I see that Alberto de Frutos from Naturgy Energy Group has joined us, so I would kindly invite him to take the floor and give us a few words, comments on what we have presented until now. Alberto, if you could please open your microphone and voila, video, perfect. Now we can see you. Alberto de Frutos is Head of International Regular Affairs at the Naturgy Energy Group. Welcome, Alberto.
Very well. Good morning to you all. First of all, I want to thank, of course, the London School of Regulation for its continuing contribution to the energy policy and regulatory debate. And today, of course, most notably the authors of this very suited and timely research. Something we all know is that trying to foresee what's going to happen along the next 30 years, it's a difficult, when not an impossible task. What's going to work better or worse? What hurdles will we find for the different vectors and technologies to develop? It's really today unknown. So it's well appreciated that this research tries to give us some light on that foreseeable future. not only providing information on the cost evolution that we can try to guess today, but also pointing to the different difficulties that we will find in the development of the different decarbonized energies. It reflects well that electrification is no doubt an important part of the equation, but at the same time that there are important limitations related to the security of supply and the development of networks in parallel. And like this, I have to say, the decarbonization of the gas system offers also a promising future, helping to reduce the need of infrastructures and helping to solve problems of security of all the decarbonized energy sector. But going into the cost side and more specifically into the citizen acceptance of decarbonization, I think this is not only linked to the pure cost of energy, which is what is mostly covered in the study, but also to infrastructures that are well mentioned but not fully covered, and also very especially to customer appliances. And this very much in the case of dwellings may lead to deep renovations that will have strong interferences with the life of people, and that happens the same with the industries and the commercial sectors. And here comes my question. And how do you see that these other cost components and interferences that decarbonization brings will contribute to shape the future development of the actual decarbonization in the different sectors?
Okay, great. Many thanks, Alberto. All right, so I would like now to give the floor to Ronnie Belmans. I introduced him already in the opening. Ronnie is a friend of the Florence School of Regulation and distinguished professor at KU Leuven. Ronnie, we look forward to hearing your insights.
Thank you, Ilaria. Thank you, James and Christopher, and Alberto also for the ideas. I think the report is very interesting. Goes a next step, also including the non-availability of electricity to produce green hydrogen in Europe as such. And it's certainly so that hydrogen is critical and import will be needed. What the next step might be, and I think that James will not like what I'm going to say here, is there's going to be a next step in this thinking process, because the thinking process now starts from the idea that we import hydrogen, which is as such the most difficult way to get that green energy into Europe. You lose 30% in cooling it down to minus 253 degrees. It's a hell of a job to transport it. And so people are thinking about methanol, are thinking about ammonia, are thinking about other molecules to bring it to Europe. So that's a point where we really have to think about, from my feeling, and we have to look into it very carefully. Both of you are talking about biogas and biogas, biomethane, methane strategy, always be careful. Cattle is prone to produce methane that is difficult to capture. But is there enough biogas, and will biogas not be captured by our friends from the biochemistry who have much more added value to do with it than we can do as poor energy people? And there is one question specifically to Christopher. I might have a different view on the fact that green hydrogen is not capex. I think it's rather capex based if you put in Oman or somewhere in the desert, PV and wind, electrolyze it with water around and make hydrogen. I don't see much OPEX in that. Can you explain on that? I'm not really with you in the thinking on that. But as such, I think that we need this kind of exercise at least every 2 years, because things are moving so fast. And as Christopher rightly said, I would not like to write the law, legislation, and regulation on this, because as we would have said in the old times, the ink is not dry before you have to change it. Lucky that we put it now on email, and that email dries faster than ink.
Can I comment on that, Ronnie?
Yeah.
No, you it's always brilliant when we have you on, because you always manage to poke holes in everybody's arguments. So you're right. Okay, so if we look at the OPEX CAPEX issue, obviously in Europe, where you have constrained electricity, you're going to end up paying the electricity price, whatever that may be, for the renewable electricity you are using. So therefore, it resembles a form of OPEX. Okay. If you have infinite amounts of renewable electricity in the EU, it becomes a CAPEX issue, because you're simply paying the CAPEX cost of producing PV-based or wind-based, whichever, but PV-based, which can be cheaper, PV-based hydrogen. So if the Sierra Nevada in Spain was infinitely big, then we could produce CAPEX-based hydrogen in Europe. So therefore, if you're producing it in the desert in Northern Africa, as you say, where you do have infinite amounts of space and infinite amounts of sunshine, the cost of producing hydrogen is simply the CAPEX of producing the PV farm and the electrolyzer, and then the desalination plant. That's basically it, isn't it? And so therefore it magically transforms from OPEX driven into CAPEX driven. And so becomes, because it's just a subset of renewable electricity produced in infinite space and perfect conditions. And then, as you say, the only problem is, okay, there's, so logically, and this follows also from the Arena study, grey hydrogen today is about $1 a kilo, or at least it was before the gas price went bananas. And so let's assume it's $1 a kilo as a residual price in 5 years. Who knows? But okay, let's make that assumption. Then, as we've seen, you're not going to be able to produce, you might be able to produce blue hydrogen at $2 in Europe, for example. But green hydrogen is going to cost you 4.5, 5. So the only logical thing in the long term, if you see the Irena study about the renewable electricity capacity in Europe at competitive rates, is to import hydrogen, green hydrogen, okay? Because if you build an electrolyzer in Europe, and on the assumption that in 10, 15 years you have a global green hydrogen market, our electrolyzers are going to be stranded assets anyway. That's clear, okay? So if you're building a green hydrogen electrolyzer today without a 20-year CFD contract for difference that is up to the date you're going to amortize it, you're going to have a stranded asset, probably, insofar as you can see the market. But as you've said, there is a fly in the ointment of, okay, you're producing your green hydrogen in Northern Africa, and how you're going to get it to the EU. As you say, if you want to actually bring hydrogen, perhaps you can comment on this. Perhaps one possibility is to mix it into the natural gas mix of natural gas that is being provided anyway, the pipeline coming from North Africa to Europe, and then de-blend it when it arrives in Spain or Italy. No idea how much that would cost, okay? But that might be an option, I suppose, from a chemistry point of view. The other option is, as you say, to cool it down to minus 260 degrees, liquefy it, put it in a boat, bring it over, and then etc. But as I said before, according to Colombia, that's going to cost you $1, $2 to do. So then you're out of market there anyway. The other is to turn it into ammonia, for example, and then ship that over in boats, and then turn it back into hydrogen once you arrive here. That's also $1 or $2 to do that. So whichever way you do it, unless you bring it in pipelines, it's not going to compete with blue anyway. And I've left aside the political, strategic, security issues that result in any event of relying on anybody. What's your take on that, Ronnie?
Let's be clear. We don't have an answer. The most important thing is that we should look how much hydrogen we really need. Okay, and that's for me not clear. For instance, we are using a lot of hydrogen to produce ammonia. Why not import ammonia as such, rather than importing hydrogen? We need a molecule that can help us through the winter. So probably that will be methanol. So I think we will see more streams than just H2 coming in, which are coming out of hydrogen in the first place. If we want to fly, it will not be with hydrogen. It might end up with e-kerosene. So, and this is going to be a logistic nightmare in the future, that we need. Now we get in boats of two types of boats, one with LNG and one with petroleum. These are the two main flows that come into Europe as energy. But if those flows are going to be in very different shaped molecules, it's going to be a logistic nightmare to pipeline them, to get them into harbors and to use them. So this is really the next challenge. And that's why I think that we should make a real analysis of what molecules do we need for what industry in future, which is for me an exercise which is not made yet. We think we're going to take hydrogen into Europe and then start everything from hydrogen. This is for sure not going to be the case.
Very interesting. So it seems we will have still a lot of work researching into these topics and molecules. I would quickly pass the floor to James because he had a point on biogas in response to Ronnie's question. And maybe, James, if you manage to respond also to the questions meanwhile arrived in the chat box, that would be appreciated. And then I will leave the floor to Christopher for the final conclusions. I'm sorry I have to leave a little bit earlier, but it was great discussion, and thank you very much to all. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ilaria. Much appreciated. Yes, on the biogas point, I think it's really interesting what Ronnie raises, because it's a question that many people see biogas as the option for having a sort of sustainable methane molecule. Of course, we know that there is a lot of methane produced sort of without any kind of policy decision or any kind of strategic planning, through the agriculture sector, through the waste sector. These are significant amount of methane of biogenic origin that is being produced anyway. At the moment, it disappears as emissions broadly. Things we can do to capture that and use it for other purposes, only really beneficial. In terms of how scalable it is, this is a big question mark, and there are very diverging policies at the national levels of how to go and what direction to go in. This recent report on the geopolitics of hydrogen and the geopolitics of gas in general proposed that potentially the future share of biogas as a component of overall commodity value of traded energy commodities could expand enormously, more than I think 40 or 50% of total traded value in energy commodities by 2050, from a relatively negligible share at the moment. So there's really a huge range in what could be done with it in terms of its applications. Again, we need to be thinking strategically about where we're deploying different molecules, where they add the most value, and this is really a coordinated planning issue. One slight addition I would make to that is we also have to consider the carbon aspect. So when we're combusting biogas, we're releasing the CO2 inside it. It's still better than it being released as methane, which is anything up to 100 times more potent than CO2, but we are still releasing a greenhouse gas. When we're able to use biogas in, for example, pyrolysis or even SMR with CCS, you're removing the carbon and sequestering it. So you're avoiding emissions associated with that methane use. Plenty more to say on that subject, but under time pressure, that's where I would leave that one for the moment. I'd just like to come back to Alberto's question very quickly. He was asking about other components that could play a role in terms of cost of decarbonisation. He's right to point it out because, of course, our study is limited in how far we can go in terms of the scope of factors that you might include. But there are really key issues that are worth a mention. So I would say one is on network build out. So when you look at gas network versus electricity, one of the main variables, and it was really just too complicated to include within the scope of our study, was the potential limitations on build out of network for renewable electricity to meet the kind of demand that's required. And that comes back to the point about overall availability and surplus versus scarcity. And although there may be the possibility to have enough generation capacity without the corresponding network or network availability at reasonable cost or within reasonable time, this scarcity issue is even more exacerbated, which comes back to Christopher's point about your hierarchy of decarbonisation. So you want to start with avoiding demand in the first place, so renovation of buildings, etc. You want to electrify because it's the most efficient, and then at the last, your last option is to turn those electrons into other vectors because you're losing quite a bit of the energy content in the conversion. So to Alberto, I would say where we can use the existing network, gaseous network, for example, is already there, capable of carrying really significant quantities of energy if repurposed and made capable of delivering those. We should be trying to maximize that and use that where we can and where it makes sense. And I would say there needs to be a lot of push and energy into building out the renewable in terms of building out the transmission grid of electricity in order to make sure that generation can come online. And that's an issue of NIMBY as well as local planning rules and such like this. And as much as we need to be focusing on generation, it does seem transportation wise there may be a strong case for transporting molecules rather than electrons. And there's also something we can say about tariffs in that regard and how the Commission has approached the tarification structure for renewable and low carbon gases in terms of how you might decide to move energy around, whether you move it in molecules or you move it in electrons. And with the discounts on the transmission tariffs under the hydrogen and decarbonized gas market package, there's obviously an incentive there to be transporting molecules. And when you're talking about power to X, electrolyzers, essentially, you have the option of localizing your electrolyzer or putting your electrolyzer close to the generation potential. These are important questions. And I think in terms of utilizing infrastructure, the gas infrastructure is really significant in Europe already. So thank you for that. I'll pass it back to Christopher then.
Thank you very much indeed, James. I mean, we could do this for hours on the basis of this study. The study throws up so many questions regarding the approach that any decarbonisation policy approach should pursue. And we just scratched the surface today. One thing it does raise to me is some important questions about the way that the EU is pursuing its policy on the basis of James's short conclusion about the hierarchy of decarbonisation, which is the hierarchy of decarbonisation should be based on the energy efficiency first principle. And that requires you, in particular, to use precious green electrons where they produce the most value for money in terms of GHG reduction and cost effectiveness. And obviously you use electrons where you can use them for direct electrification. And the other comment I would raise is what today's discussion, these numbers particularly raise, is the importance of using the market mechanism to drive a GHG and decarbonisation policy, particularly through the the emissions trading system above all, rather than technology picking winners in a by definition unpredictable energy world. Sadly enough, ladies and gentlemen, that 1 hour has flown, at least for me. I've got so much else that I would like to tease out from this study that I'm sure we will have the opportunity to do in the forthcoming events, because this is, if you like, a foundation study for a lot of the other work that one does in this area. And once again, I'd like to thank James in particular for the sterling work that he's done here. It's a fantastic piece of work. Thank you, James. And again, thank you to the Naturgy Foundation for the support in providing the finance to do this, and also allowing us the independence to do it. Thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for being with us today. And